My parents called me their bad luck. Every time something went wrong in our family, somehow it was traced back to me. A lost job, a broken appliance, a bad year. I grew up believing I carried some invisible curse that followed me everywhere I went. And for a long time, I believed them. My parents had my older brother first, and he was everything they wanted. Smart, athletic, well-behaved. Teachers loved him. Coaches praised him. He was proof, in their eyes, that they were good parents and lucky people. Then I was born 3 years later, and that's when the story changed. 6 months after I was born, my dad lost his job. My mom tells that story like it's a punchline, even now. She says things were going fine until I showed up. When I was 2, she got into a car accident. When I was 4, my grandmother died. When I was 5, the family dog ran away. None of those things had anything to do with me, but somehow they all became part of the same narrative. Me. At first, my mom framed it like a joke. She called me her little storm cloud and laughed when people looked uncomfortable. I didn't understand it then. I just knew adults laughed when they talked about me, and laughter usually meant something was okay. But over time, the jokes hardened into something sharper. By the time I was 10, it wasn't a joke anymore. If the electric bill was high, it was because I used too much power. If something broke in the house, it was because my bad energy ruined things. If my dad didn't get a promotion, it was because raising an unlucky child drained him. They said these things casually, like facts, not insults. And because they said them so often, I accepted them. My brother noticed too. He started calling me Jinx. It followed me through middle school and high school. Teachers laughed it off. Friends picked it up. Even relatives used it like a nickname. No one stopped to ask how it felt to be blamed for everything. Before you even understood what blame meant, I learned early that apologizing kept the peace. So I apologized constantly. For things I didn't do. For things I couldn't control. I learned how to make myself small, quiet, invisible. If I took up less space, maybe my bad luck wouldn't spread. I tried to earn my way out of the role they gave me. I got good grades. I stayed out of trouble. When I turned 16, I got a job and paid for my own clothes and school supplies, so they couldn't say I was draining their money. I thought if I proved I wasn't a burden, they'd stop treating me like one. They didn't. When my brother got accepted into college, my parents threw him a huge party. They invited friends, family, neighbors. They bragged about his future and how successful he was going to be. A year later, I got accepted into the same college with a better scholarship. My mom said it probably wouldn't last. My dad suggested I go to community college instead so I wouldn't embarrass them when I failed. That was the first time I understood something important. No matter what I did, the story about me wouldn't change. I wasn't failing because they believed I was unlucky. They believed I was unlucky because they needed someone to blame. I left home at 18 with 2 suitcases and a bank account I'd been quietly building for years. My parents didn't help me move. My brother didn't say goodbye. My mom told me to call when I needed to come home because she knew I would. I never did. College was hard, but not because of bad luck. It was hard because I had to unlearn everything my parents taught me about myself. I made friends who didn't see me as a curse. I failed a test once, and no one blamed me for ruining their life. They just helped me study harder next time. That was when I realized something terrifying and freeing at the same time. Nothing bad happened because I was there. I graduated with honors. I got a job. I built a life piece by piece, without their voices in my head telling me it would all fall apart. And it didn't. Meanwhile, everything they said I would ruin kept unraveling without me. And that's when I started to wonder if I was never the bad luck at all. College was the first place where no one knew the story my parents told about me. No one looked at me like I was waiting to fail. No one joked about bad luck following me into a room. For the first few weeks, that freedom felt uncomfortable, almost suspicious, like calm before some inevitable storm. I kept waiting for things to go wrong. When something didn't work out immediately, my first instinct was to blame myself. If a professor seemed distant, I assumed I'd already disappointed them. If I didn't make friends right away, I figured it was because there was something wrong with me that everyone else could sense. That voice in my head sounded exactly like my parents, even though they were 4 hours away. The strange part was that nothing terrible happened. I failed my first big exam in calculus. I stared at the grade for a long time, my stomach tight, already rehearsing apologies that no one had asked for. When I told my roommate, she shrugged and said we'd study harder next time. That was it. No accusations, no lectures, no reminders that my failure would somehow ruin her future. I cried in the bathroom afterward, not because of the grade, but because no one punished me for it. That was when I realized how abnormal my childhood had been. I started making friends slowly. I joined clubs I actually liked, instead of ones that looked impressive. I stopped raising my hand to apologize before anyone accused me of anything. Little by little, I noticed something terrifying and beautiful. People liked me, not tolerated me, not pitied me, liked me. The harder I worked, the more things improved. Not magically, not overnight, but consistently. I graduated with honors and landed a job at a small architecture firm in a city far from my hometown. I didn't tell my parents when I moved. They didn't ask. The years that followed didn't feel lucky. They felt earned. I worked late nights learning software no one wanted to teach me. I volunteered for projects other people avoided. I listened more than I talked. Promotions came slowly, but they came. Eventually, I became a project manager. I bought a small condo with my own savings. I adopted a cat who didn't run away. Everything my parents said would fall apart stayed together. Ironically, things back home didn't improve. My dad lost another job. My mom's health declined because she ignored problems until they became emergencies. My brother dropped out of college and moved back home. The golden child stayed frozen in place while I kept moving forward. But instead of questioning the pattern, my parents doubled down on their beliefs. My mom called once a year on my birthday. She always asked how I was holding up, like she expected me to be struggling. When I told her about promotions, she warned me not to get comfortable. When I told her I was happy, she laughed and said, "Give it time." I stopped sharing details. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped trying to prove anything. 3 years passed with barely any contact. Then one afternoon, my phone rang, and it was my dad. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about my life. He said my brother needed surgery, and they couldn't afford it. He said the number like it was a bill, not a request. $15,000. And since I was apparently doing so well now, I should help the family who raised me. The old feelings came rushing back. The guilt, the tightness in my chest, that familiar sense of responsibility for problems I didn't create. Even after everything I'd built, that voice still knew how to find me. But something was different this time. I didn't say yes immediately. I didn't apologize. I didn't promise anything. I ended the call and sat in silence, realizing this was the moment that would define the rest of my life. Either I stepped back into the role they assigned me, or I finally chose myself completely. For the first time, I questioned the story instead of accepting it. If I really was the family's bad luck, why did everything I touched improve once I left? And if I wasn't the problem, what did that say about them? That question stayed with me long after the call ended, quietly changing everything. After my father's call, I didn't do anything for a long time. I sat on my couch staring at my phone like it might start yelling at me again. The number he said, 15,000, kept looping in my head. It wasn't just money. It was a reminder, a test, proof that no matter how far I'd gone, my parents still saw me as a resource, not a person. That night, Celian came home and immediately knew something was wrong. I told him everything in the flattest voice possible, like I was reading instructions instead of describing how my own father demanded money after years of silence. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, and when I finished, he said something that stopped me cold. "You don't owe them your peace." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that. Still, the guilt crept in. It always did. Family helps family. Good daughters don't abandon their brothers. Those phrases echoed in my head, wearing my mother's voice. I hated how familiar it felt, like slipping into an old jacket that never fit but was hard to throw away. I called my therapist the next morning. Sitting in that familiar chair felt like time travel. I told her about the call, the demand, the way my chest tightened the second I heard my dad's voice. She listened carefully and then asked me a question that changed everything. "What do you want to do?" Not what would make me look good. Not what would stop the guilt. What I actually wanted. I admitted the truth. I didn't want to give them money, not because I didn't care about my brother's health, but because handing over cash felt like stepping back into a role I'd fought hard to escape. It would confirm everything they believed, that I existed to clean up their messes. We talked about the difference between helping and enabling, about how rescuing someone from the consequences of their choices doesn't heal anything. It just keeps the cycle alive. I left that session with homework: decide what I was willing to offer without betraying myself. That afternoon, my mother called. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention therapy or how I was feeling. She went straight into anger. She said I was ungrateful, that they sacrificed everything for me, that I owed them. Her words piled up fast, sharp, and familiar. I felt myself shrinking, my responses getting shorter, my body reacting before my brain could catch up. Then she said something that snapped me out of it. She said my brother was draining them financially, just like I always had. Something in me broke. Not in a fragile way, but in a final way. I told her I wasn't doing this anymore. I told her I would help my brother directly by finding financial assistance and medical payment options, but I wouldn't give them money. I told her calmly, even though my hands were shaking. She hung up on me. I stood there holding my phone, heart racing, realizing I had just done something I'd never done before. I said no, not quietly, not with excuses, clearly. The silence that followed felt heavy, but also clean. A few days later, I emailed my brother directly. I offered practical help, research, applications, options. I kept it simple. No family drama, just solutions. He replied 3 days later, saying they'd found another way. No explanation, no apology, just a closed door. And strangely, I felt relieved, because for the first time I saw it clearly. They didn't want help. They wanted control. They wanted me back in my old place, responsible, guilty, apologetic. I wasn't going back. In therapy, we talked about the patterns: scapegoats, golden children, families that survive by blaming one person so they never have to change. Hearing it explained didn't erase the pain, but it gave it shape, meaning. I wasn't unlucky. I was convenient. That realization hurt, but it also gave me something I'd never had before: clarity. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. After my mother hung up on me, I didn't cry right away. I stood there in my kitchen staring at the wall, like my brain needed time to catch up with what just happened. I'd finally said no, and the world didn't end. The ceiling didn't collapse. Nothing bad followed. That alone felt unsettling, because my whole life I'd been taught that pushing back would bring disaster. Instead, there was silence. Days passed without a single message from my parents. No angry follow-ups. No guilt-soaked voicemails. Nothing. And in that nothing, I realized something painful but clarifying. They weren't trying to fix things. They were waiting for me to break first. I kept replaying the call in my head, especially the way my voice got smaller before it got stronger. Therapy helped me see that part of me was still trained to submit before my conscious mind could intervene. Years of conditioning don't disappear just because you understand them. But the important part wasn't that I froze at first. It was that I eventually spoke up. That counted. At work, life went on. Projects needed managing. Deadlines didn't care about family drama. I threw myself into my job because it felt grounding, concrete, measurable. When something went wrong on a site visit, no one blamed my existence. We fixed the problem and moved on. Every normal interaction felt like quiet proof that my parents' version of reality didn't apply outside their house. Celian watched me carefully during those weeks. He didn't push me to talk when I didn't want to, but he didn't let me disappear either. One night, while we were eating dinner, he asked a simple question: what would it look like if you stopped trying to be fair to people who were never fair to you? The question sat with me long after the plates were cleared. I realized fairness had always been a trap. I kept holding myself to standards my parents never met. I was expected to be generous, understanding, forgiving, while they were allowed to be cruel, irresponsible, and dismissive. Breaking the pattern meant letting go of the idea that I owed balance to an unbalanced system. A week later, my brother emailed me again. Just a short message saying the surgery went well. No emotion, no acknowledgement of the past. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying with a simple, "I'm glad you're okay." That was it. Old me would have added more, offered more, asked questions, tried to reopen doors that were never meant for me. This time, I stopped where it felt healthy. I didn't need closure wrapped in apologies. I needed distance wrapped in clarity. In therapy, we talked about grief, not the kind that comes from losing someone, but the kind that comes from accepting who someone will never be. I was grieving parents I never had, parents who protected instead of blamed, parents who celebrated instead of competed. That grief came in waves, sometimes catching me off guard in the middle of an otherwise normal day. One afternoon, I found myself crying in my car after work, not because anything bad happened, but because something finally felt safe. Safety was unfamiliar. It made old defenses restless. Slowly, something else began to shift. I stopped flinching when my phone rang. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I stopped feeling like I had to justify my happiness. The guilt didn't vanish, but it lost its authority. It became background noise instead of a command. A few weeks later, Curtis reached out again, this time asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no out of habit, but something told me this was different. We met in a neutral place, no family home, no shared history hanging over us. The conversation was awkward at first, polite, careful. Then he surprised me by admitting he'd started noticing things about our parents that he'd ignored before. He didn't apologize outright, but he acknowledged the imbalance, the way I was blamed, the way he was protected. That acknowledgement mattered more than an apology ever could. We didn't fix our sibling relationship in one afternoon, but we didn't have to. For the first time, it felt like we were two adults talking, not characters stuck in assigned roles. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in years. That night, Celian asked how it went. I told him the truth, that it didn't magically heal everything, but it didn't reopen old wounds either. He smiled and said, "That's what growth looks like. Quiet, uneventful, real." He was right. The biggest changes weren't dramatic. They were subtle. I stopped second-guessing my decisions. I stopped bracing for punishment when things went well. I started believing that stability wasn't temporary. I even noticed my body relaxing in small ways. Sleeping better, breathing deeper, laughing without checking myself. One evening, while we were sitting on the couch, Celian said something that made my chest tighten, in a good way. He talked about the future, not in vague terms but real ones. Plans, commitments. I waited for fear to rush in, for that old voice to warn me that happiness never lasts. It didn't come. Instead, I felt calm, and that's when I knew something fundamental had changed. The curse my parents warned me about never existed. What existed was control, fear, and blame. And once I stepped outside of it, it lost its power. I wasn't unlucky. I was just the one who left. For a long time, I thought healing would feel dramatic, like some big moment where everything suddenly made sense and all the pain disappeared. That's not how it happened. Healing came quietly, in small choices that added up over time. In noticing what didn't happen anymore. My phone didn't make my stomach drop every time it rang. I didn't rehearse explanations for my happiness. I didn't brace myself for punishment when things went well. The fear that used to sit in my chest like a permanent weight slowly loosened its grip. Life didn't become perfect, but it became mine. Curtis and I stayed in light contact after our coffee. Short messages, occasional updates, nothing heavy, nothing forced. I realized I didn't need a close sibling bond to feel complete. I just needed honesty. And for the first time, he wasn't pretending everything from our childhood was normal. My parents stayed silent. Weeks passed, then months. No calls, no messages, no sudden emergencies. And that silence answered questions I'd spent my whole life asking. If they truly cared about me as a person, they would have reached out when money wasn't involved. They didn't. Accepting that hurt, but it also closed a door I'd been standing in front of for years. Therapy shifted from crisis management to maintenance. We talked less about my parents, and more about who I wanted to be now that I wasn't reacting to them anymore. That question felt strange at first. My identity had been built around surviving, proving, and escaping. Choosing what I wanted felt unfamiliar. I learned that peace feels boring when you're used to chaos. At work, I was assigned to lead a major public project, the kind of opportunity that once would have terrified me. I kept waiting for someone to realize they'd made a mistake trusting me. Instead, the project moved forward smoothly. People listened to my ideas. They respected my decisions. When problems came up, we solved them instead of assigning blame. That alone felt revolutionary. One afternoon, my boss framed an article featuring my work and hung it on the office wall without asking me. I stood there staring at my name in print, next to something I created, and felt something I wasn't used to feeling. Pride. Not relief, not disbelief. Pride. At home, Celia and I settled into an easy rhythm. Quiet dinners, lazy weekends, plans that didn't feel cursed the moment we said them out loud. I kept waiting for fear to show up when we talked about the future. It never did. The night he proposed wasn't dramatic or grand. We were sitting on the couch, dishes drying in the rack, my cat asleep nearby. He took my hand and told me he didn't want to wait for the right time because our ordinary life already felt right. His hand shook slightly when he asked. I said yes without hesitation. For the first time, happiness didn't feel fragile. Planning the wedding felt surreal in the best way. No walking on eggshells. No worrying about who might sabotage things. I made a guest list based on who actually showed up for me. Friends. Chosen family. One brother who was trying. My parents weren't on the list. I expected guilt. I felt relief instead. Holidays came and went without the usual dread. We hosted our own gatherings. Warm food. Laughter. People who wanted to be there. I realized this was what family was supposed to feel like. Safe. Supportive. Mutual. One night, I found an old box of childhood photos while cleaning. I spread them out on the bed and looked at them closely for the first time. In every picture I could see it now. The way my shoulders were hunched, the way my smile never quite reached my eyes. Even at 5 years old I looked like I was waiting to be blamed. I kept a few photos. The rest went into a donation bag. I didn't need reminders of a story that was never mine to carry. Curtis called me one evening to tell me he'd gotten a job and was moving into his own place. His voice sounded nervous and proud. I told him I was happy for him and meant it. We talked like adults. No guilt, no roles, just two people figuring things out. After the call, I sat quietly and realized something important. When I left, my parents lost their scapegoat. Without me, the blame had nowhere to land. That wasn't my responsibility to fix. The biggest shift came when I stopped wondering if my parents would ever change. Whether they do or not doesn't determine my peace anymore. I stopped needing their approval to validate my life. I stopped hoping they'd finally see me clearly. They wrote their story about me years ago. I chose not to live in it. I'm not bad luck. I never was. I was a child born into adults who needed someone to blame for their own failures. Leaving didn't make their lives worse. It just revealed the truth. When I walked away, I didn't take their luck. I took my freedom. I took my future. I took the belief that I deserved good things. And everything I built after that wasn't luck at all. It was choice. It was work. It was healing. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am. Not their curse. Not their burden. Just someone who finally chose herself.